Well, thank you very, very much, Mike, and thank you for inviting me to come and speak to you about the global economic outlook. And I've put on there planning for 2021, which obviously I think the answer to that is it's difficult at the moment, but hopefully what I can provide is an outlook for how you might want to think about all the news that will come to you, hit us all in the weeks and months ahead, and how that will affect the outlook for the global economy, for the UK economy, and then for demand for your companies. And that's, I think, the best we can do at the moment, because if you give lots of just forecasts of numbers, the one thing you can say about that for certain is that they will be wrong. I'm going to give quite a bird's eye view of the global economy and do a little bit on the UK as well. But I think in the Q&A, I'm very happy to talk about anything and everything, so long as I'm fit and able to do that. And I'll tell you that if I don't know anything about the subject, I will also reveal that. And so you don't have to bother about that. And you won't have to hear me sort of wibbling on about things I don't know about. But the really important thing is just how much the world has changed since where we were a year ago. A year ago, the virus was beginning to spread in Wuhan, and we didn't know about it. And since February or so, everything has changed. I was at the World Economic Forum in Davos at the end of January, and pretty much no one was talking about it. There was a sort of little bit of chatter on the sideline saying, well, what about this virus in China? But everyone said, well, yes, it'll be a little bit like SARS in 2003. Might affect Asia a little bit, but it won't affect the world. Well, we know that's very, very different now. And one of the things that we've had to deal with a lot this year, there's a good thing, is we've had to learn. And learning has been the biggest thing I think economics has gone through this year, and it's work in progress. So as I was saying to Mike before we started, everything is developing at the moment, and I will try and give you a sense of where economics is right at the moment, but also a sense of what we know and what we don't know, and so what we're looking at. Well, right in the past week, we've actually had two enormous pieces of news. I'm going to go through the first one first, and we'll talk about the second one as we go through. The first one is, of course, we have a new president-elect in the US with the election of Joe Biden as president. And so this is going to be clearly an important thing for the world economy. I think there are certain things that we can say definitively. There will be, as he said himself, an end, or he'll at least try and end demonization from the president itself. That doesn't mean that US politics will necessarily change. There'll be a greater value on truth, on science in the US. And but make no mistake, the US isn't going to change fundamentally. The US will still do what it wants to do in its own interests. I think what will happen, the biggest difference is that the US's own definition of its own interests will change. It'll be less short-term and more strategic. And that might actually bring up some rather difficult challenges for continents such as Europe, where the strategic difference with China, the US is much more likely to try and get its allies on board with it and trying to have a united front against some of the trade practices of China, which will be difficult, particularly for countries like Germany, rather than go it alone, gung-ho, tariffs, trade wars, all of the things we've seen and experienced, which have been rather unpleasant in the past 4 years. But if you're thinking what specific differences might there be under a Biden-Harris administration, I think you can think of 4 things that are almost certainly either definitively going to change or quite likely to change. The first is environmental policy. So Joe Biden has said that on his first day in office on the 20th of January, he will sign executive orders to rejoin the Paris climate change agreement. The US has only literally just left it. That in itself won't change US policy or global policy, particularly overnight, but it will mean that there is a greater global movement towards lower carbon emissions. And in particular, I think it means that we'll see long-term ambitions put in place. The question, which we don't know the answer to yet, is what it means for the short term. Because if there's a trade-off between short-term growth and environment, you can still see that countries, the two big players in this, US and China, are still likely to go for the short-term growth, while saying a little bit like St. Augustine that they'll be good, but not quite yet. And we see that certainly with China. But I think the longer-term ambitions will be there, and that then enables the world to start to put in place policies such as scrapping polluting vehicles 5-10 years ahead, but those deadlines do come forward quite quickly. The second is on trade. I think this is good news for Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Nigerian former finance minister who was being held up to be the new Director General of the World Trade Organization, held up by the US, by the Trump administration. She will probably be accepted by the Biden administration, and that matters to the extent it means it shows that the US will be engaging with the rest of the world on the trade front again, rather than going it alone. I don't think that the engagement will be anything other than pretty robust. And the US under a Biden administration is almost certainly going to want significant reforms of the WTO, but will try and do that by co-opting European and Japanese and the advanced economies, essentially to try and be more robust with some of the emerging markets, and in particular China. So I don't think we're seeing the end of trade wars, but we're probably seeing the end of a very, very loud and aggressive trading position that the Trump administration took. And then two other things I think are very important in the reasonably near future, which don't get the same play as climate or trade. Very hard to find a good picture for the third one, but it's international taxation, and particularly the taxation of multinational companies. At the moment, we are just on the verge of a new trade war between the US and Europe, and in particular the US and France and the UK, on the basis of the European digital services taxes. These are taxes on the turnover of digital companies, particularly the US tech giants in our jurisdictions, which we have put in. The UK has got one in, France has got one in, which is going to start collecting money in December. And the US has threatened to put tariffs on French goods and UK goods very soon after money is collected. Now, there is an international process that has been going on at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris, which has come up with a compromise which literally no one likes, but is probably the only way to make the international taxation of multinational corporations go away as an issue, which is to gradually move away, very, very gradually move away from physical presence being the determination of multinational taxation towards where people sell. And this would affect not only the US tech giants, but also big European companies, the big French luxury goods companies, or big German luxury automobile makers would also find that that the US would have some taxing rights over them. And there's about $100 billion at play under current corporate tax policies. And so the alternative is really, the choice will be for countries, will be for the US in particular, where the US has been stalling this process, is either sign up to these new rules, might be difficult with Congress, or there'll be some form of Wild West where lots of countries will go after the US tech giants, and then the US will be faced with having to retaliate. So this is going to happen, the action on this will happen in the first half of 2021, and the G20 finance ministers meeting under the Italian presidency has already been delayed till after January the 20th, so when Biden comes in, so that with the hope of making progress there. There's a short window where progress can be made. And finally, COVAX, which is part of the World Health Organization, which is the attempt to have fair coronavirus vaccines across the whole world, fair purchasing. The question will be, again, will the US join this? It hasn't so far. It doesn't mean that the US has to join the purchasing scheme. The UK is a member and it's buying its own vaccines, but it's a way of trying to make the whole world have access to vaccines at a reasonable price. And of course, that matters for the economy because it's not only having your own population safe against coronavirus that will enable the economies to get back to normal, it's for the whole world as well. You won't be seeing lots of trade and movement of people between advanced economies and the emerging world unless people are sure that it's safe to travel there too. But let's talk about the vaccine, the coronavirus itself, the pandemic. First of all, let's just go through some stats. As you can see, here's our rather nice graph of deaths since the start of the year. I say nice, but I mean nice as in it's pretty rather than it's displaying something that's very nice to think about. We saw the big wave in Europe in the spring, moving away and then coming right back today. We've seen sort of more gradual disease progress in the US and in other parts of the world. So one thing we know is the disease is back. Actually, since this, I put this chart in at the weekend, we're now at a higher level of deaths than in the first wave globally. So we are very much in a second wave. And the response to this has been by governments essentially to put in restrictions once they feel their economies or their countries can no longer operate without restrictions in a safe way and their health services can stay under control. So this is data from the University of Oxford, and you can see again from the dark colours on the chart that most countries, particularly European countries, had very, very strict lockdowns in the spring, gradually loosened them, probably too much because the virus came back and they're now being reimposed. But it's very important, I think, to get the causality right here. Clearly, we know that the lockdowns have had a very, very big impact on the global economy. So here's a very simple chart of global growth. And you can see the global financial crisis. We thought that was the worst crisis since the 1930s in the global economy when it happened just over a decade ago. And the world economy just contracted a tiny bit in 2009. This year, we think the global economy is going to contract by about 4, 5, 6%. That number is very, very uncertain at the moment by huge multiples of the contraction in the global financial crisis a decade or so ago. So this is the worst crisis that the world has seen in economic terms since the Great Depression in the 1930s. And certainly the deepest recession since World War II. And I think you always need to have that in mind. So we see virus, we see restrictions, and we see a lot of economic pain in terms of lost output compared with where we were. But it's important to get the causality right here. And it's not that restrictions cause the economic pain, even though, of course, that is the proximate cause quite often of if your pub is shut, you cannot operate. It is the proximate cause, but ultimately it is the virus that's ultimately causing the economic difficulties. And I think you can see this again through looking at the different experiences of different countries. And so this chart shows on the x-axis, you can see the cumulative deaths per million people. So the further to the right of the chart you are, the worse it is. So Belgium here is in the worst position. There's obviously measurement error because the UK had a lot of deaths it wasn't measuring, which were to do with the virus. So the further right, the worse in terms of people dying. And the further down you are, the bigger economic hit you had in the first half of the year. And as you can see, there's essentially a negative correlation here. So that if you had a worse experience with the virus, if you let it rip more, you didn't actually get any economic gain from that. So the idea there's a trade-off between restrictions and lives and livelihood is actually ultimately wrong. The long-term relationship is between keeping your population reasonably healthy and the economic hit. So you can see that countries such as China and Vietnam, who had very short lockdowns but very, very strict ones, have done rather better than most other countries. Or Korea, where test and trace worked, has had and worked both to keep the country healthy, but also kept its economy hit rather smaller. So this doesn't tell you what the right economic policy is, because it's going to be different in different places. So some countries think New Zealand, who've been very successful at controlling the virus with a suppression, get rid of it entirely. That can be one very successful strategy. But so can the sort of Asian strategy of an effective test and trace system, which has worked very well in Asia, but sadly not in Europe, even in countries such as Germany, where it worked in the first wave, but not in the second wave. Or you can have very early lockdowns, and you can think Finland, Denmark as countries, examples where that sort of works. Or you can think of Sweden, where voluntary distancing can actually help, even though it didn't helped in its economy, but not very much on death. So it's a much more complicated and sort of richer picture for what seems to work around the world than we often hear, where we say, well, where we have a sort of domestic argument about lockdowns versus lives, and that is that gets the causality, I think, entirely wrong. So what have the effects been so far? What is the outlook? I'm going to use the UK here, UK forecast, not because it's anything special, because these things will apply to pretty much every economy around the world. It just gives us a sense, since we're all in the UK, we can see a sense of how serious it is and what the recovery is likely to look like. As you can see here, these are Bank of England forecasts just from last week. We have a very serious, a very severe downturn in 2020, which happened entirely in the first and second quarter. So we lost essentially 25% of the economy in the first half of the year, followed by a very rapid recovery in the third quarter. We're going to get those figures tomorrow. And now with the renewed spread of the virus, we're going to get a little second dip, but nothing like as serious as the first dip. Why is that? One, because we haven't recovered fully. So lots of things like public transport and those sorts of activities aren't actually operating, so they can't fall again. But secondly, it's much shorter. So people will spend on either side of this recovery, of this second lockdown, and the growth of the virus again is much, much weaker than it was. There's a lot less of it about than there was in the spring. So there is going to be a bit of pain again. We're going to suffer, but not nearly as severe. And then it's likely we're going to have quite a strong recovery in 2021. But as you notice, we don't get back to where we started from at the start of 2020 till the start of 2022. So we lose quite a lot of ground. And if you think about it, we were expecting the economy to grow. So we're quite a long way behind where we would have liked to have been. Similar with inflation, we've not seen this as an inflation shock. There's been a hell of a lot of government spending going on, but there's been a need for that. You could think of that as insurance rather than sort of a splurge in government spending. They've insured companies and households against the pandemic. And still, we've had a big demand fall as well. So inflation has come down close to zero and is not showing any signs of getting out of control. Unemployment, on the other hand, is rising, has been rising fast. Redundancies we saw yesterday were very strong. But and now with the second lockdown and the extension of the job retention scheme, we expect the growth in unemployment to be rather slower, but still to get up to levels we last saw in the great financial crisis, the global financial crisis a decade ago, about 7 to 8%, before coming back down again. So we see a relatively sharp rise in unemployment, but then coming back down. And the thing that has been making the recession and the unemployment growth a lot better than it otherwise would have been is the most enormous amount of government borrowing. About 20% of national income the government is likely to borrow this year, £400 billion. If you think the equivalent amount in the global financial crisis, which we thought was the worst in peacetime, was 150 billion, you can see how much the government has done and how quickly it has done it. I was talking to one of the people who designed the job retention scheme, one of the two people in the Treasury who did that over a 2-day period in late March, which showed again one of the better aspects of government response was the very rapid movement of policy in response to the crisis. So if that's the sort of broad outlook for the economy, what is the real problem? And I think these two pictures show what the longer term issue is. So if all it was that we've had this pandemic, very, very severe downturn, and then a rapid recovery back to where we thought we would have been in early 2020 before the pandemic struck, that wouldn't be a real problem. The government would borrow to insure us through that. We could then get back to where we were. There would be additional debt, both public and corporate debt, because of the pandemic. But it wouldn't in the end be a very, very long-term crisis. And with interest rates as low as they are, you would be able to, the debt would be quite serviceable, again, both for the public and private sector. So the thing that economists really worry about with this pandemic, and it's exactly what happened after the global financial crisis caused a rather nasty decade in the 2010s, is what we call scarring. So long-term problems which come from the pandemic, long-term difficulties that we don't get back to where we were quickly or at all. So what sorts of things are these scarrings? Well, if you take a look at the left-hand picture, which was London in March or April in the first lockdown, it's how much stranded capital is there? What are you not getting? And so what things which used to work don't work anymore? Are people going to go back to offices as they would? Should capital now be reallocated away from central London to the suburbs or to rural areas where people might want to live more? And how much capital has been built into the way that we operated economies, which is no longer needed? This is, sometimes in the summer, this was rather pejoratively called the, what's going to happen to Pret in the middle of London, and that whether that is a problem. But I think it's much more important, not only in terms of the capital that might be no longer needed, think whether do we still need the Elizabeth line that is being built under London as we speak, but also in terms of personnel, if people aren't going to come back to offices anymore, does this mean that there is a longer term hit to productivity, to being able to employ new people, train them effectively, get them to understand the culture of businesses? These things, I think, are much more difficult to resolve. One of the things that we know is the reason big cities exist and have been so successful across the world has been because smart people have been close to each other, and you pick up things along the way, whether it's in the lift, in your own company, or down the pub where you meet people from similar industries, or in events. All these things might not happen. And I think this is concerning for productivity growth in the years ahead. And certain sectors, if we look at the right-hand side of the screen, travel being a particular example here, might simply not come back quickly at all. These are large sectors where you are going to have persistent damage to the economy, which means that the idea that we get back to where we were, I think, is rather fanciful. Now, economists have a real difficulty, and this is where what we don't know about trying to put a scale on the scars. The Bank of England for the UK has a number which it just raised last week to 1.75% of national income. The International Monetary Fund has said maybe up to 5%, and these differences really matter. So if we lost 5% of our economy essentially for good, that has very, very large impacts on both businesses and the viability of many businesses, and the public finances, because we'll lose the same tax revenue and have just as much public spending need than if it was in the order of 1%. And this is where I think the vaccine news this week, has been incredibly optimistic and encouraging, because it's not so much that it will mean that we'll have a very rapid recovery as people begin to get herd immunity, if it works effectively for the community, but it's that we can more quickly get back to where we were to actually get the economy operating in a productive way without having to essentially scrap sectors and move people around. And I think if you remember this rather crass advert that the government had, which wasn't intended to be put out, it was an old advert, but Fatima's next job could be in cyber. She just doesn't know it yet, which caused a huge stink in September. The more the vaccine, if it's effective, means that people do not have to retrain, do not have to change the industries they're in, the lower the long-term scars, and the better it is for people. Certainly better for Fatima if she can be a ballet dancer and pursue the career she wants to pursue, rather than having to move careers and presumably take up something else at a lower level of productivity and pay. So the other question is, how big is this effect? Well, I think one of the things the Bank of England put out last week was very interesting. Is how much task reallocation is there likely to be, given the way that that spending patterns have changed during the pandemic this year. As you can see, this chart goes back to the 1970s. We saw a very similar form of reallocation of tasks with the end of manufacturing, or the deindustrialization of the UK, which was huge in the 70s and 80s and 90s. As you can see, there were very, very large impacts on the amount of tasks people had to reallocate. So the chart here shows, relative to the average of the past 40 years, which periods had more or less task reallocation. Now, this is obviously very difficult to do, but the emerging view coming out of the Bank of England, at least, is actually the end of manufacturing was much, much bigger in terms of scars and redundant skills and people being out of work for a very long time than recent years. We talk a lot about the fourth industrial revolution, but in terms of what people are actually doing in the tasks in their jobs, that hasn't been changing as much as the first wave of computerization, which ended typing pools and all the other aspects that were there. The Bank of England's scenario for what the pandemic might be is that it makes things more difficult than the most recent 5-year period, but really, again, not that serious. So if you wanted good news, I think that is the best news, is that the scars with a vaccine and with the underlying structure of the UK economy at the moment might not be quite as bad as we feared even a few days ago, before we had the news on the vaccine. So what is policy doing just to ensure that we have the best outcomes we have? Again, I'm going to do this for the UK, but this is global. We have quantitative easing, that is the central bank essentially creating money, printing it, and buying government bonds. It's now going to go up to £895 billion, the amount of money it's printed and bought. It's an absolutely enormous amount of money, getting on for 40% of the size of the UK economy. But Bank of England's got a bit of a problem here, because it likes to say that the reason it's doing this is to keep interest rates low, and it's got ammunition. But effectively, it says that the last thing you should think of is that this is actually funding the government's budget deficit, because it doesn't want to be seen as giving the government a free hand or free money or a magic money tree. Essentially, that is, though, what it's doing. It's allowing the government to borrow money incredibly cheaply, because it doesn't have to always find new investors for that money. And that's a very effective policy. If there was any sign of inflation around the corner, the Bank of England would have to stop. And that's the the legitimate sort of backstop we have. This isn't Weimar Germany or Zimbabwe or Venezuela. It's the Bank of England is in control of the amount of money it prints and buys government bonds. And it's doing that on the basis of what is likely to keep inflation under control. Very hard to calibrate, but it's not been doing a bad job there. It's also said, and this is its new statement, that essentially it doesn't intend to increase interest rates at any time until unemployment comes down significantly. And there's some sense that inflation is going to be going above the 2% target. So again, we're going to have low interest rates for a very long time. And the third thing it's thinking about doing is it is thinking about having interest rates go negative. This tweet on the left, it actually put out on Thursday where it showed the interest rate had gone negative. This was one of these terrible screw-ups that happen occasionally at the Bank of England. It was the wrong tweet, the wrong slide they put out, because again, I think it's actually quite encouraging. It shows that the social media team didn't know the decision that the Bank of England policymakers were going to take until it was taken, and so accidentally they prepared many slides and accidentally put the wrong one out. But this is under discussion, so they are thinking, and I don't think it's going to happen until 2021. And even then, I think it's less likely than more likely, is we might see interest rates go negative. And what that would mean would be for companies, not necessarily for households, money in the bank, there would be an effective tax on money in the bank. And again, that would be to try and encourage companies to spend money and not save it. But the real action has been on fiscal policy, where that's changed across the world. In every country, we've seen, instead of the worry about deficits and debt, we've seen the head of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, talk about the only thing that matters is to be able to dare. And Carmen Reinhardt, who was, after the global financial crisis, one of the people who provided the intellectual underpinnings for austerity, saying, well, this time around, you need to worry about fighting the war you're in, you figure out how to pay for it later. I think this is particularly important in the US, where, again, the new Biden administration isn't in any mood to tighten fiscal policy in the years ahead. Whether they can ensure this gets through Congress is still unknown. But Jason Furman and Larry Summers, they are two Biden advisors, where they say essentially the reduced probability of a fiscal crisis does not outweigh the cost of deficit reduction. So they are absolutely not going to go in for deficit reduction if they can get that through. So just finally, to look at the UK very quickly, we've had a very, very poor decade for real earnings growth. In the 2010s, we had the financial crisis in 2008-09, and then we had a long period where we had relatively high inflation, falling sterling, but wages, being a very flexible labour market, our wages didn't grow very fast, so average real earnings fell. We had the worst decade for real earnings growth for 70 years in the UK. We're likely to go through another period of that in the years ahead. So again, that will be one way that we pay for the crisis, will be that on average, wages are likely to be low. Brexit's almost certainly not necessarily going to help, because that is most likely to slowly undermine our productivity relative to other countries as well. But you can see that the past decade has been very different from the post-war average of about 2% real earnings growth every year. And so we've moved into a new world. What's really happening in the labour market? Well, it's not been that lots of people have been fired. We do hear about quite a lot of redundancies because they make news. But the big reason that unemployment has gone up, you can look at the green bars. So people losing jobs has been very similar to the financial crisis and to the post-crisis period. Is that companies are not hiring. They're not hiring new recruits. And that's what means that, particularly for people coming onto the labour market, they're not getting into work at the moment. And that's what's driving the rise in unemployment right at the moment. Who's being hit? Well, I think we know it's very much the young. These are the people on the right who are either lost their jobs, furloughed, or had their hours cut. It's 18 to 24-year-olds. It's been people in jobs, consumer-facing jobs, often in the lowest paid fifth. So it's been poorer people and younger people. Not so much of a gender split as we thought at first. We thought at first it was more likely to hit women a lot more than men. This would be the first recession that's done that, but that hasn't ultimately played out in the same way. So just to conclude, it's the virus that's the problem, not the restrictions. The effects are huge, but policy has provided a huge amount of insurance to help us get through this crisis. It would have been enormously worse without governments, and this has been across the world. So the best outcomes for countries have been where they've kept the virus under control. The second best is where, like the UK and the US, where we've had very, very active government. The thing that really matters for the long term is scarring. And on that, the news is better than it was a week ago. But don't expect miracles. The recovery will come, but it'll be slow and difficult. But I think I'm going to end with a good thing. The recovery will come.
Wow. Well, that's a little bit of cause for optimism at the end there, Chris. I mean, thank you for that. But just before throwing it out for questions, just dwelling on that last point, where do you think we're going to be in 2 to 3 years' time? What's going to happen with travel? What's going to happen with construction, retail, financial services? Where's the growth and recovery going to come? And where isn't it?
Well, I think let's take the things that are in real trouble at the moment. Travel, I think, is an area where we have some knowledge of what happened after 9/11, after the Twin Towers. That took about 4 or 5 years for travel globally to get back to the level it had been previously in 2001. So I think we should expect travel to be very slow in recovering. We're simply just not going to have 7 flights a day to Brazil, which are full in the near term. And you're going to have the prevalence of the virus really right down globally before we get back into any sort of back to normality there. I think equally that applies for domestic travel, particularly public transport. Particularly in big cities. So London, we will see, I think, a real reluctance to go straight back onto the tube in the way we did, both for health reasons and because there's almost certainly going to be a lot more persistent working from home. And so those two things will mean that in travel, I don't think we're going to get back to normal quickly. In other areas, I think, we've already seen in consumer spending, people have been willing to spend the money they've got. So we've seen consumer spending came back very quickly, and there were very quick reallocations between buying personal services or consumer-facing services such as restaurants and leisure and cinema and theatre and orchestras. And we've seen a lot more purchasing of goods, wine, and those sorts of aspects. So it seems like households are very quick to reallocate money. But if you say 2 years ahead, I think we're still going to be feeling we're not going to be back to normal because there's too many of the particular sectors that have been extremely hard hit that will have long-term implications. And I think in particularly here of travel, sort of the leisure industries and bricks and mortar retail. So if you were the owner of a lot of shops, then I think you would again worry somewhat about it because people's tastes have changed and the way they're shopping has changed.
Okay, thanks for that. A couple of questions on the chat line. Neil Fulger, he's asking, do you see any new or specific opportunities for UK productivity improvement post-COVID as the economy recovers?
I think there is one opportunity. I think most of it's bad news, sadly, and it's bad news because the way we reallocate capital is almost certainly enforced on us rather than something we've chosen to do, and therefore it's likely to be less productive than the way that we used to run. But one piece of good news, and there is some evidence for this as well, has been that one of the real problems that the UK has faced has been a long tail of unproductive companies, and and it's different to other countries that we have this long tail. Now, there is some emerging evidence that the crisis was provoked companies into digitization. Exactly these companies that have always thought, what's the point before I'll use my old database, I'll use some spreadsheets, I won't have a management system to operate my company. And they found that once everyone had to go and work at home, the choice was between having really modern, productive business systems or going out of business. And so there is some evidence that that has improved. And if that can improve the long tail of companies, then that would be the one bright spot. I think we need to wait for a little bit more evidence, but that is something that is hopeful out there.
And thanks, Chris. Here's a question from John Whelan. He said, Chris, you talked about scarring and permanent loss of economic activity. And are we able to measure new economic activity created as companies refocus and create different business propositions?
We can. I mean, there's always new economic activity, I think, is the rather sort of boring, dismal science that economist answers, that we always have new economic activity. So you have to ask the question, is there more new economic activity than before? Is that more productive than what we've lost? The answer, as far as the economic answer is, we think there will be more new economic activity, and that's partly in the areas that I was saying, in digitization and digital. Online retailing is the obvious example here, where it's gone from about 21% of consumer purchases to 28, 29%, and rising still. But the opinion at the moment among almost all economists is that the losses are likely to be bigger than the gains. So we don't know the level of scarring, but it's a net figure, it's not a gross figure. So that net number I said was between 1.5% of national income, which ultimately is not too bad. That's a lot better than the global financial crisis. Up to 5%, which is again then getting into figures where we know we have a lot of pain to come.
And there's a tricky question here from Peter Blawston. And he said the last Labour government left a note saying there's no money left. But isn't one of the lessons from COVID is that politically there always is money available? Yes,
I think we've learned that the constraints on government finance are much looser than they were. That is absolutely for certain. So we don't have to worry about the bond markets being king, as we thought they were in the 1990s, where people said they wanted to be reincarnated as the bond market because that was the way you could push politicians around. Now we are able to borrow at incredibly cheap rates, and the constraint on this borrowing really, there's two constraints. One is whether the private investors are willing to finance the UK government or other advanced economies. Now, at the moment, there's no question about it. They're willing to finance it at negative rates in many instances, but that's not uniform across the world. So emerging markets do not have the same options that advanced economies have. And so we've seen across the emerging world, we've seen fiscal crises this year, we've seen debt defaults. And so there's no guarantee that the willingness of investors always to finance the government is always going to be there. And secondly, if we hit resource constraints in the economy, ultimately, if we do turn into Venezuela, Zimbabwe, or Weimar Germany, if we print too much money and pump too much money to pump up demand in the economy, and that goes ahead of the resource constraints of what the economy can produce, ultimately that will be inflationary. We know that. And so we have this delicate balance. So there are two constraints on government, but the big news is that yes, we have a lot more resources, and we've used them pretty effectively this year to provide the natural insurance. No private company could provide the insurance the government has provided for a pandemic. And that is the exact role of the state, is to be there when no one else is there and able to do it. So
another question from Lee Sprung, and this is just the the question I suspect you get a lot, and everybody's got a view on this, but the question is, how damaging do you think a no-deal Brexit will be at this time as we begin to move out of the pandemic?
Well, I think there's two ways to look at this. I think one is it's extremely damaging in that it's unnecessary, puts up barriers between us and our biggest trading partner, is very damaging for different sorts of companies, the companies that haven't been particularly hard hit by the pandemic. So it's just putting another group of companies, particularly automotive and manufacturing, in the spotlight, and parts of financial services as well in the spotlight on the 1st of January 2021, creating further damage. I don't think the real fear was going to be massive disruption at port. I think we're going to get some of that anyway, whether we get a deal or not, because there's going to be a lot more paperwork that trading companies need to fill in. But ultimately, that is quite small. The Bank of England last week suggested it might be 1% of GDP, where we saw a 25% fall in output over the year. So the scale of the damage, I think, is rather small. But no deal means that is definitively a scarring episode. So that creates further damage to sectors of the economy that have been relatively lightly hit by the pandemic for a very long time. And it's the bad will, I think, that will come from it, both with our trading partners in Europe, but also with the US and what it makes us look like in the global in the global policy debate. That means that it's actually really rather more damaging than the initial numbers are going to be. So don't expect the big problem of a no-deal Brexit being the first few months of January, though they might be quite difficult. But it's the longer-term impact that's what's much more serious.
And questions coming in from different perspectives, but from Bola. You touched on how empty the centre of London and other cities is. Do you see this more permanent shift to the suburbs? And what's an economist's view on whether we'll return to offices in the city centres?
I think we will see clearly. I think we've seen a few things. We've seen that people's productivity about being able to work from home has been much better than we feared in March and April when it first happened. But now we're worried about training, about culture, and about the ability to have those casual interactions for the longer term. So I think we're more likely to move to a sort of a mixed mode, even if the virus entirely goes away, where there'll be significantly more home working, but quite a big return to offices. And that might well be quite encouraging for places like London, because it means that ultimately it won't be so full, and it can expand its reach further out and further away, so long as the transport links are sufficient. What I think ultimately it probably means slightly worse productivity, because we don't have as much agglomeration effects of big cities. But I don't think we're going to go back to a situation where everyone is sitting at home, which I think is really rather serious for that.
Yeah. And here's a tax question from Beata. What's your view on the probability of raised level of taxes to pay off government debt, in particular CGT and upper income tax, which could result in some financial services firms moving to other European countries?
I think the probability of higher taxes is extremely high, but not yet. So I think we're talking sort of 2023, 24, when the recovery is really going strongly. I'm sure we're going to have to not pay off the debt, because we're not going to pay off this debt, but we are going to have to get our public finances into a sustainable position, which will mean ensuring that the debt service burden doesn't rise, or the burden of debt isn't keeping on going up. I know in about half an hour's time, there's a very big report coming out from the Office of Tax Simplification on capital gains tax, which I can't reveal at the moment, but it's suggested some really quite radical things. These things are definitively on the agenda, and whether the Treasury in the end goes for them or not, I think is pretty moot at the moment. I think it will go something like this, that at the moment, no one's thinking about tax rises. They're not going to come in the budget in March if we have a budget. But the first thing that we need to get a good handle on is the level of scarring. Because if all that happens, if we go straight back to where we were and it's as if we've had a disastrous nightmare and we get back to where we thought we were, then ultimately we don't really need tax rises at all. We've just got an increased amount of debt and we can service that over very, very many years. The more scarring we have, so where we have a big recovery but we don't get back to where we were, that means you have persistently lower tax revenues than you thought you would. You have more borrowing and you have debt rising and rising and rising. And that's where you will need almost certainly to have tax increases. The government's in a very difficult position because it's ruled out the most obvious tax increases, as rises in the main rates of income tax, VAT and national insurance. These are the things that really raise revenues. I would have thought corporation tax is almost certainly going to rise as a rate, and they will look at capital taxes to some degree. But remember, you don't get huge amounts of money from capital taxes, so they will have a trade-off about exactly what the questioner asked about whether what sort of behavioural impact it might have against the revenue it raises. And this will be a big debate, I think, in the next 3 years, and it'll come in sometime when we think we've got the economy back on track, because the Bank of England, frankly, can't keep up demand on its own and does need fiscal policy to act. They have to work in tandem at the moment. And so we're not going to see very rapid move back to austerity at all.
Questions from all shapes and sizes now, Chris. Question here on productivity. And the question really is productivity from home working. So there are pluses for this and there are also minuses. What's your view?
My view is that in the short term, the minuses have been much smaller than we thought. And so people have been much more productive than was feared in the spring. But in the longer term, when you have staff turnover, and you want to have people training and gaining new skills and picking up the sorts of things that you pick up from being in the office, being around other people, which you don't pick up on a meeting like this. It's the conversation we might have if we were wandering out of this Zoom meeting, if we were doing this in real time. These things that aren't happening in the same way now. And that's actually rather bad for productivity. And I think that's going to be the dominant feature. So it's going to be bad for productivity. That's the net. But as the questioner said, not everything is obviously bad.
Okay, thanks. Before asking Phil to give a two-line summary of this or two-line question, any more questions from anybody in the audience? One or two people have been surprisingly quiet. You've obviously numbed everybody into submission there, Chris, which is I think you're the first person who's done that. We've not had that before. What did you think, Phil? Upbeat, downbeat?
Well, I was reminded last night of the Churchill quote that there is nothing government can give you that it hasn't taken from you in the first place. And it just occurs to me, I said that to my 24-year-old last night, and he looked at me as if I was completely stupid. He looked completely confused. And it looks to me like we've moved away from the world where the government can't give you something that it hasn't first taken from you, to a world where there is indeed a magic money tree. It's ironic, isn't it, that modern monetary theory and magic money tree both begin with MMT, but it just seems that the world has changed in terms of having to pay for what you consume. Is that your perspective, Chris?
I half agree with that. The world has changed for now, and the government is essentially borrowing from the future. We are going to pay for this. We are going to service these debts over a very long period. And the magic money tree doesn't exist to the extent that you can just spend whatever you like and pay for whatever you like, because you have resource constraints of the economy as a whole. So if, let's say, the government decided to hire or seek to hire 500,000 new medical staff, and there weren't 500,000 people who were able to do it, ultimately that means the price goes up, inflation goes up, and so you hit your resource constraints. And you get exactly what happens in any country that can't finance itself and doesn't have the resources domestically to do that, and you just get an inflationary spiral. So that is always possible. What's been rather encouraging is that we seem to be quite a long way away from that. So we have quite a lot of leeway to essentially print money and finance government, allowing it to insure us against this pretty awful risk for the time being, and that is quite a long time. But there is going to be a reckoning. Let's be under no doubt. We are going to have to get our public finances into a sustainable position again, because as the economy recovers, then you get much closer to that resource constraint. In fact, we want to be running the economy at the resource constraint where there is no unemployment. So if you pumped more demand in, all that would happen is you get inflation. That's where we want to be at, and at that point, you can't get any more. And so we're trying to get back to that cyclical point, and we're pulling out all the stops at the moment. And when we get there, we will know that we still have almost certainly a bigger deficit than we'd like to have, a bigger deficit than is sustainable in the long term. And you can't have explosive paths of public sector debt. So there is a reckoning, and it will come. But what we've learned is that it doesn't have to come right now.
Thanks for that. We've got one last question before closing down, and it's a view on house prices. Does it vary between the short and long term? And what impact is remote working having on this? And is it regionalized?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think the best insight I had when I was doing a piece of work on exactly this, where we were talking about, are people all going to be moving out of central London flats to the suburbs or to rural areas, was, well, actually, no. The simple answer to that is no, because there simply aren't the houses or the homes in those other areas, and they're not going to be built at any time soon. So the only thing that can happen is prices can change. So I think we're going to see quite a big change in relative prices of housing. So if demand moves towards people wanting to work and live further away from the centre of big cities, that will mean that the prices of suburban and rural houses will rise relative to the prices of inner London houses, and those price changes could be really rather large, because you can't have everyone moving and it'll be the richest people who will have the biggest choice, obviously, of where they want to live, and so you could get some really rather big relative price changes.
Chris, that was brilliant. You danced very elegantly between so many diverse subjects. So that was a really good session. So thank you very much for that. Thanks to the audience for the questions. We will, as I say, have the notes to Steve by the end of the week. So thanks for joining us, and hope you all have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.